Hi, so you know how to shade. You know how to use a pencil, you know how to use a wide variety of pencils, you know which pencils are soft and can make darker tones, you know which pencils are hard and can make lighter tones, you know how to really bear down on the dark tones and to draw really lightly with the light tones. You can make a value scale like a pro. You know how to avoid all my pet peeves with shading. You don't do streaky shading, you don't do sloppy shading. Sometimes some of you do a blended technique, some of you do a different kind of technique and keep it a little bit looser. Cool, you're all doing great. But you're never gonna really know how to shade a whole drawing unless you understand where to put the different darks and lights. And the way to understand that is to really get good at analyzing planes. A plane is a flat two-dimensional surface similar to a sheet of paper, but with no thickness and no finite length or width. So you're analyzing the surface of things. Planes are considered flat surfaces of things, and sometimes your surfaces are going to be curved, but you can break those into more simple. You can simplify that into more flattened areas, just a lot more of them. When you're blocking in a drawing, which is, as you remember, similar to doing a gesture drawing, but a little bit of a later stage, you naturally develop into identifying planes as you try to describe the form that you're looking at. You can definitely see that here, where you're looking at how this man's side twists. You kind of see the front of his abdomen here, and then you see the back plane here twist around the back. And if that artist hadn't done that, this would look kind of amorphous and confusing, but because they broke down those planes, you can understand how the body fits together even before the shading is done. So if you think about it, you want to be looking for the simplest forms that you can find, the simplest planes and the simplest volumes. So you can do a cross contour like on the left and it gets really complicated. You can also analyze it the way it's done on the right with much more simplified forms, and you could say, okay, if the light is coming this way, then the light's coming from the left, then the whole left side is going to be more illuminated than the right side. So as I mentioned before, even rounded surfaces can be reduced to a group of flat planes as a method for being able to understand them better. It would be an infinite number of planes in an actual sphere. But as you can see, if you look at the cube, it's pretty easy to see where that shadow goes on the right. When you look at a sphere with so many planes, you're going to have a different area of highlights, different areas of shadows, but it may be easier to analyze when it's broken down like this. When you look at the object here they're calling the icosphere, it's a little easier to understand where light hits and where shadow hits. And so maybe simplifying more than is an actual the actual object you're looking at will be helpful in figuring out light and shadow. So this is an example. I really like to think about the meme that says how to draw an owl, and then it says draw a circle, and then the next frame over says draw the rest of the bleeping owl, because that's kind of what some of these how to draw books look like. But the most important lesson to take from these how to draw books is that you can really start with geometry, and that's going to help you understand the overall form. And if you understand the overall form, you can understand how to shade. So here you have an example of a CGI wireframe, which is, incredibly complex, and the computer programmer can do a lot to create the light and shadows. As somebody who's drawing from life, you would want to break things down into simpler forms, like in the gecko on the right, where you can see how his chest kind of juts out a little bit, and then his pelvis goes back a little bit. And so if we were shading him, you could figure out where to change the tone. So you might have, if light's coming down from the upper left, then his chest would be illuminated and there would be a little bit of a shadow in that shape underneath. So Alberto Giacometti, I love using him as an example of somebody who draws looking for those plane changes. So when you're drawing before you start shading, you want to look for those plane changes. If you're drawing something like origami that has a lot of flat planes, that's going to be an easier thing to do. But you can do it even when you're drawing organic, lifelike, and round shapes. It's a very good trick for drawing hands. You can draw a hand without doing this, but I like to call these the hands in the upper left. I like to call those robot fingers because it can be really helpful to draw in those robot fingers and then figure out where the shadows go so that you don't create floppy glove-like, Mickey Mouse glove-like fingers, but rather really show the structure of the hand underneath. It's really easy to think of fingers as just like these amorphous 5 protrusion ones when really they do have sides and tops, bottoms, and another side. So this is the slide that you're going to want to come back to practice drawing spheres. It has such a good example of all the different kinds of light and shadow to look for. When you're drawing and shading, you want to cover the entire paper with some kind of tone that if you're drawing reductively, like you might with charcoal, you would literally cover the entire paper with tone before you start and then erase out your highlights. Often when drawing with graphite, i.e. pencils, you would just leave that white area and fill everything else in with, I'm talking right here, but you would fill everything else in with at least a very, very light tone. A classic mistake is to draw the ball but have just the shadow part all like a dark crescent and then leave the rest white. But what that does is it flattens the object out. That makes sense in the polygonal volumetric shape to the left because this is a flat shape, so it can all be that bright white the way that this highlight is. But because this isn't, it won't all catch light the same way, so you need to add in these light shapes. So you have highlight, light, that's here, shadow, core of the shadow, which just means the darkest spot, and then there's often reflected light in your shadow, and sometimes even a reflected shadow. And then of course we have cast shadows, which are the shadows that the objects put onto other objects instead of just the shadows on those objects. So again, we're thinking about simplification. To me, this looks like some kind of robot situation, but what it turns out is that it's actually a drawing from the 1500s of figures simplified. So it's a way of figuring out how figures look, where light falls on the figures without drawing out the complete anatomy. And so, you can observe what you're drawing that way. You can plan out composition this way. In your future work, it has endless things that you can do with using planes. In fact, so much that you could go into, complete abstraction and have a lot of fun moving these, creating different planes to look like you're creating space, even though this one, of course, has nothing to do with creating a more realistic situation. It is creating a more realistic space in an abstract situation. So that's what I have, except, of course, for this, which I think is also really fun. So the idea of invention, drawing from your imagination, we aren't really doing that right now. I want to focus on drawing from observation at first. But if you really understand how to analyze light and how it hits planes in your objects or figures that you draw, then you'll be able to do it from your imagination as well. So this surrealist, Giorgio de Chirico, was able to make this really interesting invention using the planes and create this surreal figure. So these are really good skills.